Autumn officially arrives this Saturday, and so with the changing of the seasons, it gives us another opportunity to sit down with our good friend, Dr. Chris Palma, from the Penn State Department of Astronomy and Astrophysics. I trust summer treated you well, Chris?
Oh, yeah.
I thought it treated me very well because one enduring memory I will have, other than the rain, is that when there were clear skies, the planets were just splayed out in the evening. Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, and recently Venus. How common is it to have all four of those in the evening sky together?
So I'm actually going to add, for some part of that, Mercury was visible as well. So there were 5 of them. It's one of those things, a lot of times in astronomy you might hear, this is a once in a lifetime, go out and see this. The most recent time before this was about 10 years ago, where you could see a similar sight. But it's rare enough that when there are 4 or 5 planets in the sky, get outside and observe them. It was beautiful.
About 70% of our planet is covered with water. And so I was kind of intrigued when I saw a study from some of your faculty looking at planets that are completely covered with water. Tell us about that study.
Yeah, and I think as well, they were essentially doing very simple climate modeling, right? So the idea there is we now know that we can find planets around other stars in what's called the habitable zone, where the temperature would be right for water to be liquid on the surface. But the assumption has been that you need a planet with both oceans and land, like Earth's, in order to support life. But what's gone on is that you've had astronomers work with folks who are more experienced in modeling our own planet and said, what if you had an ocean planet? Would it be able to support life? And all of the computer modeling suggests that you would be able to have a stable climate capable of supporting life on a world that was 100% ocean covered.
Nice overlap between astronomy and meteorology. There was some other interesting space news the last couple months. I know last month a new space probe was launched toward the sun, supposed to eventually get as close as maybe 4 million miles. I mean, that sounds hot and it sounds dangerous.
Yes.
I mean, what's the goal here?
Yeah. Well, when we think about the sun, the part of the sun we're most familiar with is the orange glowing part of it, right? But the sun has an atmosphere, and the sun's atmosphere is immense, and the sun's atmosphere is the most mysterious part of the sun. It can be 1 million degrees in the atmosphere, and we're not quite sure why, or how does the atmosphere get heated up so much more than the visible surface. So this Parker Solar Probe is going to be right at that interface, close enough that it will be able to sample the what's called the solar corona. But you're right, it's going to be dangerous. The sun-facing side of that probe will get as hot as 2,500 degrees, so they've had to build an incredibly thick heat shield to protect the sensitive electronics.
I also saw there was some international space intrigue, some finger pointing about a really tiny hole in the International Space Station. I mean, who done it?
Yeah. So it's interesting, right? Because there's a lot, scientists like to think that, the work of science transcends politics, right? And I know we've had plenty of international scholars in my department that have worked together, but our space programs do work together, right? The International Space Station is the International Space Station, and our astronauts get there on Russian Soyuz vehicles. So even when the crew members get along very, very well, unfortunately, politics bleeds into this, and so some of the Russian officials of their space agency have implied that perhaps sloppy American astronauts caused this trouble, and our astronauts have said, no, it's really obnoxious of you to accuse us of this because we're professionals and we would not do something like that.
I mean, but the good news is this is not a problem that is threatening to the astronauts.
Yeah, absolutely.
I was also intrigued, of course, next year marks 50 years since man first set foot on the moon, and I saw a recent report that we can now explain a slight warming that was observed in the 1970s on the surface of the moon, and it has to do with the astronauts.
Yeah. This was an interesting one to me too, right? Because I don't remember hearing too much way back when about the change in the moon, but one of the things that the astronauts did was place sensors on the moon, and so those sensors showed that over a few years in the early 70s that the surface temperature near those sensors rose about 2 degrees, and so the question was why? And the explanation that we've sort of come to this conclusion just recently is that pressing down, the footprints that the astronauts made when placing these sensors actually disturbed the surface, changed the reflective properties of the moon, so the moon was reflecting away less sunlight, and that's why it heated up.
Change the albedo of the moon.
Yeah.
Sounds like a problem for my freshman meteorology students. Why don't we close up? Are there any other interesting stargazing opportunities in the next couple weeks or months?
Sure. I don't think I've mentioned this one before. Right at this time of the year, if we do get some clear skies, I want people to look for what's called the Great Square of Pegasus. So depending on the time, around the southern sky, you should see this large square. Then you'll see some stars that are part of the constellation Andromeda. And if you can make out a little fuzzy blob, that's actually the Andromeda Galaxy, which if you're at a dark enough site, you can see without a telescope.
Okay, but a pair of binoculars would make
Absolutely.
it even better. Dr. Chris Palma, always good to see you.
Thank you.
And we will be back in a moment with a recap of the short-range forecast.